The move into apartment 4B was meant to be a fresh start for David Keller. After a divorce that had drained the color from his world, the small, one-bedroom unit in the suburban town of Millbrook felt less like a home and more like a temporary shelter. The building was a nondescript, three-story structure, the kind you pass 100 times without ever really seeing. It was quiet, which he appreciated, and cheap, which he needed. His new life was built on a foundation of solitude and routine: work at the local community college, microwave dinners, and the faint, lonely hum of the television. The first week was a blur of unpacking boxes and avoiding eye contact with neighbors in the hallway. He learned the rhythms of the building by accident. The family in 2A had kids who ran to the school bus at 7:15 a.m. The elderly woman in 1B listened to the radio at a low volume all day. And then there was the man in 3A. The man in the apartment directly below his was a ghost. His name, David would later learn from a piece of stray mail, was Marcus. But for those first few days, he was just a collection of unsettling observations. The most noticeable thing was his schedule, or rather, his complete lack of one that aligned with the normal world. David, a light sleeper, would often wake in the dead of night to use the bathroom. It was in those silent, pre-dawn hours that he would hear it, the soft, deliberate click of the building's heavy front door downstairs. It was a sound that spoke of someone coming or going at a time when most people were lost in dreams. Curiosity, a feeling he thought had died with his marriage, began to stir faintly within him. He started to notice other small things. Marcus never seemed to receive mail. He never had visitors. His curtains were always drawn tight, regardless of the time of day. It was as if the man was actively trying to not exist, a notion that should have been forgettable but instead planted a seed of unease in David's mind, a seed that was quietly, patiently waiting for the right conditions to grow. The seed began to sprout about 10 days after David moved in. It was a Tuesday, and he had a rare late afternoon class. Returning to the building around 9 p.m., he saw a figure struggling with the main entrance door. It was a man, but not Marcus. This man was large, unkempt, and seemed agitated. He was carrying a heavy-looking duffel bag over one shoulder and a large toolbox in his other hand. He finally got the door open and disappeared inside. David, hanging back, felt a prickle of intuition. He waited a full 5 minutes before entering himself. The hallway was empty. As he walked past the stairs leading to the lower floors, he heard a sound that stopped him cold. It was a muffled thud, followed by a short, sharp scrape, coming from the direction of apartment 3A. He stood frozen, his keys in his hand, listening. Then, just as suddenly, there was silence. It was a thick, heavy silence that felt more unnerving than the noise itself. For a moment, he considered knocking on the door, a ridiculous, intrusive impulse he quickly dismissed. He told himself it was the sound of someone simply moving furniture. People rearranged their living spaces all the time. It was a perfectly logical explanation. He went up to his apartment, made his tasteless dinner, and tried to watch television. But his mind kept drifting back to that thud and scrape. He thought about the man with the duffel bag and the toolbox, and the ghost-like tenant below. He realized he had never, not once, heard a single noise from apartment 3A during the day. No television, no footsteps, no conversations. It was an island of absolute quiet in a building full of small, human sounds. That night, as he lay in bed, he waited. And at 3:17 a.m., he heard it. The soft, deliberate click of the front door. He got up and peered through his blinds. A moment later, a figure emerged onto the street below. It was Marcus. He was walking away from the building at a brisk, determined pace, carrying a large black plastic bag. He didn't look back. He simply walked to the corner and disappeared into the night. The image of that bag, lumpy and heavy, burned itself into David's mind, and sleep, for the rest of the night, was impossible. The next morning, David's curiosity had hardened into a morbid obsession. He called in sick to work, a thing he never did, and spent the day constructing a plan. He needed to see. He needed to know. The logical part of his brain screamed at him to forget it, to mind his own business, but a darker, more compelling voice urged him forward. That evening, he went to a large electronics store and bought the smallest, most discreet spy camera he could find. It was a decision that felt both thrilling and deeply wrong. He waited until the building was quiet, until the family in 2A had gone to sleep and the radio in 1B had fallen silent. Then, just before midnight, he crept down to the second-floor landing. His heart hammered against his ribs. From this spot, he had a clear, angled view of the door to apartment 3A. With trembling hands, he positioned the tiny camera on a small ledge where it was hidden by a fire extinguisher, aimed directly at Marcus's door. He tested the angle, made sure it was secure, and then hurried back up to his apartment, feeling like a thief in his own home. The waiting was the hardest part. He spent the next 2 days in a state of agitated paranoia, jumping at every sound in the hallway, terrified that Marcus would discover the camera. He barely ate, barely slept. He just watched the live feed on his phone, a grainy, static image of an empty corridor. On the second night, at 2:43 a.m., the feed flickered to life with movement. A figure appeared on the screen. It was the large, unkempt man from the other night. He walked up to Marcus's door, gave a quick, practiced knock, and was immediately let inside. David's skin crawled. The man was there for less than 20 minutes. When he emerged, he was no longer carrying the duffel bag or the toolbox. He was empty-handed. He simply walked away, disappearing down the stairs and out of the camera's view. David rewound the footage, watching the exchange over and over. Where were the bags? They hadn't come out. They were still inside apartment 3A. The implication was chilling, and it confirmed his darkest suspicions. The next morning, a Thursday, David made a decision that would seal his fate. He couldn't go to the police. What would he say? That his neighbor had a strange schedule and received a visitor late at night? It was nothing. He needed proof, real proof. His obsession shifted from passive observation to active intervention. He decided to become a silent, invisible enemy. He would sabotage the man in 3A. It started small. That night, when he heard the front door click, signaling Marcus's departure, David crept down to the second floor. He found the main circuit breaker panel for the building. With a deep breath, he flipped the switch for apartment 3A. The satisfaction was immediate and intoxicating. He imagined Marcus returning to a dark apartment, his refrigerator full of spoiled food, his plans disrupted. He hurried back to his own apartment, his pulse racing with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. The next day, he watched from his window. He saw Marcus leave in the late afternoon, his face an unreadable mask of calm. David waited an hour and then executed his next move. He went down to the basement and found the main water valve for the building. After some fumbling, he managed to turn off the supply to apartment 3A. It was a petty act of war, a mosquito biting a lion. But for David, it was a declaration. He was no longer just a passive observer. He was a participant. He was fighting back against the evil he was certain lived one floor below him. He felt a strange, powerful rush. He was a hero, a ghost protecting the innocent, one small act of sabotage at a time. He didn't stop to think about what would happen when the lion decided to swat the mosquito. He didn't consider that a man like Marcus, a man who lived in the shadows, would be acutely sensitive to any change in his environment. David was too caught up in his own game, blind to the danger he was inviting into his own life. For a week, David's campaign of anonymous harassment continued. He would turn off the power, shut off the water, and even superglue the lock on the main entrance door late at night, forcing Marcus to struggle with it. Each act felt like a small victory. He watched the camera feed obsessively, hoping to see some sign of distress from his target. But Marcus remained a ghost. He came and went at his usual hours, his face revealing nothing. The lack of reaction began to unnerve David more than any response could have. It was like trying to hurt a shadow. The turning point came on a Sunday night. David was reviewing the footage from the camera when he saw something that made his blood run cold. It was from 3:52 a.m. The door to 3A opened. Marcus stepped out. But he didn't walk toward the stairs. Instead, he walked directly toward the camera. He stopped right in front of it, his face filling the grainy frame. He looked directly into the lens, and for a long, terrible moment, he simply stared. Then, a slow, cold smile spread across his lips. He reached out a hand, and the screen went black. David stared at the static on his phone, his body numb with fear. Marcus knew. He had known all along. The sabotage, the surveillance, the games, it had all been seen. David had thought he was the hunter, the ghost in the machine. But he had been wrong. He was the one being watched. He was the one being played with. He was the mouse, and the cat had just decided it was time to stop playing. He didn't sleep that night. He just sat in the dark, listening to every creak and groan of the old building, expecting at any moment to hear a heavy footstep on the stairs leading up to his apartment. But the night passed in silence. The silence, however, was far worse than any noise. The following days were a waking nightmare. David went to work, he taught his classes, he came home, but he was functioning on autopilot. His mind was entirely consumed by the man downstairs. He removed the destroyed camera, too terrified to even touch it properly, and threw it in a dumpster miles from his home. He stopped the sabotage. He became a model of invisibility, just as Marcus had always been. He tried to convince himself it was over. Marcus had simply destroyed the camera and moved on. He had sent a message, and David had received it loud and clear. The game was over. But a week later, he came home from work to find a small, brown paper bag sitting on his doorstep. It was tied with a simple piece of string. His name was not on it, but he knew, with a dreadful certainty, who it was for. With shaking hands, he picked it up and carried it inside. He opened it in his kitchen, his breath catching in his throat. Inside was a single item, the superglue tube he had used to sabotage the lock. It was empty. A small piece of paper was taped to it. On the paper, in neat, block letters, was a single sentence: "I fixed the lock. You broke my routine. Now I will fix you." David dropped the tube as if it were on fire. It clattered onto the kitchen floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent apartment. The message was clear. This was no longer a game of cat and mouse. This was a declaration of war, a promise of retaliation. The anonymous saboteur had a name and a face now, and the ghost in apartment 3A was coming for him. David looked at his own front door, suddenly feeling its flimsy wood offered no protection at all. The hunter had become the hunted. Panic set in. David's first, rational thought was to go to the police. He grabbed the bag, the tube, the note, and drove straight to the Millbrook Police Department. He waited for over an hour in a sterile, brightly lit room before a weary-looking detective named Harris agreed to see him. David spilled the entire story, the strange hours, the visitor with the duffel bag, the camera, the sabotage, and finally, the threatening note. He expected action, perhaps even gratitude. Instead, Detective Harris listened with a neutral, almost bored expression. When David finished, the detective leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Keller," he said, his voice flat. "Let me get this straight. You illegally placed a surveillance device in a common area of your building to spy on your neighbor. You then repeatedly vandalized his property by tampering with the building's utilities and locks. And now, you want us to investigate him because he left you a vaguely threatening note?" David's stomach dropped. He tried to explain about the man with the bags, the strange noises, his gut feeling. Harris held up a hand. "I understand you're frightened. But from where I'm standing, you're the one who committed the crimes here. Your neighbor has done nothing illegal that you can prove. He keeps odd hours? That's not a crime. He has a friend over? Also not a crime. My advice to you is to go home, apologize to your neighbor if you can, and stop breaking the law." David left the station in a daze. The system, the very thing he had counted on for protection, had failed him. He was alone. He drove home in a fog of fear and despair. As he pulled into his parking spot, he saw a light on in apartment 3A. Marcus was home. And for the first time, the light from that window felt like a pair of eyes, staring directly at him. That night, David didn't even try to sleep. He sat in his living room, in the dark, clutching a heavy flashlight like a weapon. He listened. The building was silent. The family in 2A was asleep. The radio in 1B was off. There was only the oppressive quiet. And then, at 2:11 a.m., he heard it. A soft footstep in the hallway outside his door. It was just one, a single, deliberate creak of an old floorboard. His heart stopped. He stared at the door, his eyes wide with terror. He waited for a knock, for the door to be forced open, for anything. But there was nothing. Just the silence, thicker and more terrifying than before. He sat there, frozen, for what felt like hours. When the first gray light of dawn finally began to creep through his blinds, he dared to move. He crept to the door and pressed his eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty. He opened the door slowly, his hand trembling. Taped to the outside of his door, at eye level, was a single photograph. It was a picture of him, taken through his own kitchen window. He was making coffee, his back to the camera, completely unaware. David ripped the photo down and slammed the door, his body shaking uncontrollably. Marcus had been inside his home. He had been in his apartment, watching him, and David hadn't heard a thing. The locks, the chain, it was all meaningless. Marcus could come and go as he pleased. David was not safe anywhere. He was a specimen in a cage, and his keeper was letting him know that the walls were an illusion. The psychological warfare intensified. David became a prisoner in his own home. He stopped going to work, too terrified to leave and too terrified to stay. He would sit for hours, just staring at the door, jumping at every tiny sound. The incidents continued. He would find his mail had been opened and then resealed before being put back in his box. He would come back from a quick trip to the bathroom to find a cabinet in his kitchen slightly ajar, a cabinet he knew he had closed. One evening, he heard music. It was faint, a low, melodic tune seeping through the floorboards. It was coming from apartment 3A. It was the first sound he had ever heard from that apartment. He pressed his ear to the cold floor. It was an old song, something his grandmother used to listen to. It was eerie and out of place in the dead silence of the night. It felt like a message, a taunt. He was breaking his own rules of silence just to torment the man above him. David's grip on reality began to fray. He started talking to himself, just to hear a human voice. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He was a man unraveling, slowly and publicly, with no one to witness it but the ghost below. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't go to the police. He couldn't fight back. His only remaining option was the one he had been too proud to consider from the very beginning. He had to leave. He had to run. He had to admit that he had lost. That night, he started packing. He would leave at dawn. He would just drive away and never look back. He never made it to dawn. Around 4 a.m., exhausted and emotionally drained, David finally succumbed to sleep, slumping over on his couch. He was woken by a sound. It was a soft, metallic click. The sound of his own front door unlocking. He sat up with a jolt, his heart slamming against his ribs. The room was pitch black. He could see nothing. He could hear his own ragged breathing, too loud in the silence. Then, he heard it. A soft footstep in his own living room. Then another. The floorboards, the ones he knew so well, were creaking under someone else's weight. A figure emerged from the darkness of the hallway, silhouetted against the faint light coming from the window. It was Marcus. He stood there, perfectly still, just a darker shape in the dark room. David tried to scream, but his voice was gone. He tried to move, but his body was frozen. Marcus took another step closer. He was close enough now that David could see the glint of his eyes. They were calm, almost curious. "Hello, David," Marcus said. His voice was soft, ordinary, the voice of a neighbor asking to borrow a cup of sugar. The sheer normalcy of it, in this context, was the most terrifying thing of all. "I'm sorry to drop in unannounced. But you've been such an attentive neighbor. I felt it was only right that we finally meet properly." He took another step, and David saw that he was holding something in his hand. It was a roll of thick, silver duct tape. David finally found his voice. It came out as a strangled whisper. "Please, don't." Marcus tilted his head, a gesture of genuine curiosity. "Don't what? Don't defend myself? You've been attacking me for weeks, David. You invaded my privacy. You broke my things. You tried to disrupt my life. And now you're packing to leave? You think you can just walk away?" He shook his head slowly. "No. That's not how this works." He moved with a speed and precision that was shocking. Before David could react, Marcus was on him. One hand clamped over David's mouth, the other grabbed his wrist, twisting it behind his back with expert ease. David struggled, but it was like a child fighting an adult. Marcus was incredibly strong. Within minutes, David was bound to a wooden dining chair in the center of his own living room, duct tape wrapped around his wrists, ankles, and chest. Marcus stepped back and surveyed his work. He pulled up another chair and sat down facing David, close enough that their knees almost touched. He was calm, relaxed, as if he were settling in for a chat with an old friend. "You want to know what's in my apartment, don't you?" Marcus asked. "You've been so curious. It's only fair I show you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times and then held it up for David to see. The video was grainy, shot in a dimly lit room. It showed the large, unkempt man from before. He was on his knees, his hands tied. Another figure, unseen, was speaking in a low, calm voice. The voice was Marcus's. The video showed things that David's mind could not process. It showed violence, pure and methodical. It showed a toolbox, open, its contents gleaming under a single light bulb. David squeezed his eyes shut, a moan of horror escaping his throat. Marcus put the phone away. "My work is a necessity, David. A dirty job, but someone has to do it. I clean up messes that the police can't or won't touch." That man in the video? He hurt children. He was a monster. I am simply the monster who hunts monsters. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You couldn't leave it alone, though. Your curiosity, your self-righteous crusade. You had to interfere. You made mistakes. You left traces. You forced my hand." David sobbed, tears streaming down his face. He tried to speak through the tape, but only muffled, desperate sounds came out. Marcus watched him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "The question now is, what do I do with you? You're not a monster. You're just a lonely, broken man who stuck his nose where it didn't belong. Killing you would be messy. It would create questions. And I hate questions." He stood up and walked to David's kitchen. He opened the refrigerator, peered inside, then closed it. He opened cabinets, inspecting the contents with mild curiosity. He was acting like he owned the place. He came back and stood over David, looking down at him. "I have a proposition for you," he said. "One chance. You will leave. Tonight. You will take nothing but your car keys and your wallet. You will drive as far as you can, and you will never, ever come back to Millbrook. You will never speak of this to anyone. If you do, I will know. And I will find you. And the next time, we won't have a conversation." He pulled out a small knife and, in one swift motion, cut the tape binding David to the chair. David gasped, slumping forward. He was free, but he had never felt more trapped in his life. David didn't hesitate. He didn't pack. He didn't grab his phone or his wallet. He simply ran. He stumbled out of his apartment, down the stairs, and out the front door of the building, his bare feet slapping against the cold pavement. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, collapsing on a bench at a bus stop miles away. When the sun came up, he was still there, shivering in the morning light, a man who had lost everything but his life. He never went back to Millbrook. He never called the police again. He started over in a new state, with a new name, a new job. He lived in a constant state of low-grade fear, always looking over his shoulder, always jumping at the sight of a stranger who looked too long in his direction. Years passed. The fear faded to a dull ache, a scar on his memory. He almost convinced himself it had been a nightmare. Then, one evening, in his new, safe apartment in a new, safe town, he came home to find a small, brown paper bag sitting on his doorstep. It was tied with a simple piece of string. His blood turned to ice. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. He simply stood there, staring at it, knowing that some games never really end. The ghost from the third floor had found him again. And this time, there would be no warning. This time, there would only be silence.